In the supermarket line, my grandson shouted, "I won't obey you." My mom said, "You're not my real grandmother." My blood froze. Was my daughter-in-law still playing her games? So, the next day, I prepared a surprise. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined that my world would come crashing down in aisle 7 of Peterson's grocery store between the cereal boxes and peanut butter jars. But there I was, frozen in place, watching my 7-year-old grandson Christopher throw what could only be described as a calculated tantrum. "I don't have to listen to you," his voice echoed through the store, drawing stares from other shoppers. "My mommy said you're not my real grandma." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, my grip tightening on the shopping cart handle until my knuckles turned white. The elderly woman behind me gasped audibly, while a young mother quickly ushered her own children past us, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Christopher stood there, his small face flushed with defiance, his blue eyes, so much like his father David's at that age, blazing with a conviction that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't a normal child's outburst. This was something else entirely, something planted. "Christopher, sweetie," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible above the store's background music. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." He crossed his tiny arms across his chest, a gesture that reminded me painfully of his mother Aria when she was being particularly stubborn. "Mommy told me the truth. You're not my real grandma, so I don't have to do what you say." I glanced around desperately, hoping this was some kind of nightmare I could wake up from. But the curious faces of strangers, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor, the mundane reality of shopping carts and grocery lists, it was all too real, too humiliating, too devastating. My mind raced back to just 10 minutes earlier, when I'd picked Christopher up from his after-school program. He'd seemed perfectly normal then, chattering about his day, excited about our planned grocery trip to buy ingredients for his favorite cookies. We'd done this routine dozens of times over the past 3 years. It was our special tradition, Grandma Janet's Cookie Day. But now, standing in this fluorescent-lit aisle, I realized that everything had changed. Somehow, between the school pickup and this moment, my relationship with my only grandchild had been poisoned. "Christopher," I tried again, crouching down to his eye level despite my arthritic knees protesting. "You know Grandma loves you very much. I've always been your grandma, sweetheart. Always." He took a step back from me, his small face scrunching up in confusion and anger. "No, Mommy showed me pictures. She said you're lying. She said Daddy doesn't even know the truth yet. But she's gonna tell him soon." The blood drained from my face. Pictures. What pictures could Aria possibly have? And what truth was she planning to tell David, my son, my beautiful boy whom I'd raised alone since he was 2 years old, after his father died in that construction accident? David, who called me every Sunday without fail, who brought Christopher over for our weekly cookie sessions, who still hugged me tight every time he saw me. "What kind of pictures, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. But Christopher had already moved on to the nuclear option. In a voice loud enough to reach the checkout counters, he announced, "I want my real grandma, not you!" The store seemed to fall silent. Even the background music felt muted. I was aware of people pulling out their phones, probably recording this public meltdown for social media. The shame burned through me like acid. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and began pushing the cart toward the exit. Christopher followed, still sniffling and muttering under his breath about fake grandmas and Mommy's pictures. The drive back to David and Aria's house was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Christopher sat in his booster seat, arms crossed, staring out the window with that same defiant expression. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, trying to understand how my sweet, loving grandson had been turned against me so completely. When we pulled into their driveway, I noticed Aria's car was there. Of course it was. She'd probably been waiting, knowing exactly what kind of scene would unfold at the store. The thought made my stomach turn. Aria opened the front door before we'd even reached the porch steps, wearing that smile I'd learned to recognize over the past 5 years, the one that never quite reached her green eyes. She was 28 years old, petite and blonde, with the kind of polished appearance that came from having time and money to spend on herself. Everything about her always seemed calculated, from her perfectly styled hair to her designer workout clothes. "How was grocery shopping?" she asked sweetly, ruffling Christopher's hair as he ran past her into the house. I stood there on her doorstep, this woman who'd been systematically undermining me for years, and felt something crack inside my chest. "We need to talk." Her smile widened. "About what, Janet?" The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter in her mouth, made my hands clench into fists. "About what you told Christopher, about these pictures you supposedly have." Arya tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, that. Well, children deserve to know the truth, don't you think? Even when it's complicated." "What truth, Arya? What are you talking about?" She glanced over her shoulder, making sure Christopher was out of earshot, then stepped closer to me. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word felt like a dagger. "I know what you did, Janet. I know the secret you've been keeping for 35 years. And soon, David will know too." Before I could respond, she'd stepped back inside and closed the door, leaving me standing alone on the porch, my mind reeling with questions and a growing sense of dread that something much bigger than a child's tantrum was about to tear my family apart. As I walked back to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys, one thought kept circling through my mind. How had Arya found out about the adoption? And more importantly, what was she planning to do with that information? Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it made its familiar creaking sound, my mind spinning with memories I'd buried for decades. The adoption. How had Arya discovered something I'd never told a living soul, not even my closest friends? By 4 a.m, I'd given up on sleep entirely. I made my way to the spare bedroom that served as my home office, switching on the small desk lamp and pulling out the old metal filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years. My hands shook as I rifled through folders of tax returns, insurance papers, and medical records, searching for something I prayed was still there. Finally, at the very back of the bottom drawer, wrapped in a faded yellow envelope, I found them. The adoption papers from 1988. David had been 6 months old when his birth mother, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah, had made the heart-wrenching decision to give him up. I remembered her face so clearly, young, terrified, but determined to give her baby a better life than she could provide. My late husband Robert and I had tried for years to have children. After countless doctor visits and failed treatments, we'd turned to adoption. The moment they placed that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I knew he was meant to be ours. David wasn't just adopted. He was chosen, wanted, loved beyond measure. The paperwork was all there, exactly as I remembered, legal, proper, completed through St. Mary's Catholic Charities. But as I studied the documents more carefully, something caught my eye that I'd forgotten about over the years. There were 2 copies of everything, one set for our records, and another set that had been filed with the state registry. My blood ran cold. The state registry, of course. If someone knew where to look, if they had access to the right databases or knew someone who did, they could potentially find these records. But how would Arya even know to search for them? What had made her suspicious in the first place? I set the papers aside and thought back over the past few months, trying to pinpoint when Arya's behavior had shifted from merely cold to actively hostile. It had been gradual at first, little comments about how David had inherited his stubbornness from somewhere, or observations about how he didn't look much like me. I'd brushed off these remarks as typical daughter-in-law territory, the kind of subtle digs that some women made to establish their place in the family hierarchy. But then I remembered something that made my stomach lurch. About 6 weeks ago, David had mentioned that Arya was interested in genealogy, that she'd been building family trees and researching bloodlines. She'd even convinced him to take one of those DNA tests, claiming she wanted to learn more about their heritage for Christopher's sake. The DNA test, of course. If David's results had come back showing no genetic connection to me, Arya would have had her smoking gun, but that didn't explain the pictures Christopher had mentioned, or how she'd gotten access to specific adoption records. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. First to St. Mary's Catholic Charities, where a sympathetic but firm administrator explained that all records from that era were sealed and could only be accessed by the adoptee themselves, David, once he turned 18, which he had, of course, but he'd never expressed any interest in finding his birth parents. However, the woman added carefully, there have been some data breaches over the years. Nothing we publicized, you understand. But sometimes information ends up in places it shouldn't be. My second call was to my old neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who'd lived next door to us when David was little. At 83, her memory was still sharp as a tack, and she'd always been fond of David. "Oh, honey," she said when I explained my situation. "I remember that girl coming around when David was maybe 4 or 5 years old. Pretty little thing, very young. She'd park across the street and just watch your house. I always wondered if she was his birth mother, trying to catch a glimpse of how he was doing." My heart stopped. Someone was watching our house? Just a few times over the years. Always the same car. An old blue Honda, I think. The last time I saw her was maybe 15 years ago. I never mentioned it because, well, it didn't seem like she was causing any trouble. Just a mother wondering about her child, I figured. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, pieces of a puzzle slowly fitting together in my mind. If David's birth mother had kept tabs on him over the years, if she'd somehow stayed in the area or maintained connections here, it was possible that information about David's adoption had survived in ways I'd never considered. But how did this connect to Arya? How had she gained access to information that even I had kept locked away? The answer came to me like a lightning bolt. Arya worked at Henderson Medical Group as a billing coordinator. She had access to medical databases, insurance records, patient histories going back decades. If David's birth mother had given birth at Henderson Regional Hospital, which many young mothers did in the 80s because of their charity program, there might be records there that Arya could access. I grabbed my purse and keys, my hands steadier now that I had a plan. It was time to pay a visit to Henderson Medical Group and find out exactly what my daughter-in-law had been digging up about my son's past. The drive across town gave me time to think about what I would say, how I would approach this delicate situation. Arya wasn't just some random person I could confront. She was David's wife, Christopher's mother, and unfortunately someone I had to continue dealing with regardless of what I discovered. Henderson Medical Group occupied a modern glass building on the east side of town, all chrome and clean lines that reflected the morning sun. I'd been here countless times over the years for David's pediatric appointments, and later for my own medical care as I'd aged. The receptionist, a woman about my own age with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up as I approached the front desk. "I'm looking for Arya Winters," I said, using her maiden name since that's what she went by professionally. "She works in billing." "Oh, Arya's not in today," the woman replied. "She took some personal time off. Can I help you with something else?" Personal time? Of course she had. She was probably at home right now, planning her next move, figuring out how to use the information she'd gathered to maximum effect. "Actually," I said, an idea forming, "I was wondering about accessing some old medical records. My son was born at Henderson Regional in 1987, and I need some documentation for insurance purposes." The receptionist's expression became more cautious. "What kind of documentation?" "Birth records mainly, proof of parentage." The lie came surprisingly easily. "There's been some question about his benefits eligibility." She nodded sympathetically. "Oh, that's frustrating. But I'm afraid those records from the 80s aren't computerized yet. They're all in storage, and we'd need a formal request with proper identification and legal authorization. It's quite a process." My heart sank, but then she leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, though, Arya's been asking about those same kinds of records recently. Something about genealogy research. She seemed to know quite a bit about the old filing system, more than most people would." She paused, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Is everything okay with your family?" I forced a smile, even as alarm bells rang in my head. "Everything's fine, just some paperwork issues." But as I walked back to my car, I knew that everything was far from fine. Arya hadn't just stumbled upon information about David's adoption. She'd actively searched for it, using her position at the medical center to dig through records she had no business accessing. The question now was what she planned to do with that information and how much time I had before she destroyed everything I'd worked so hard to protect. The phone call that changed everything came at 7:37 that evening. I was sitting in my living room, still processing what I'd learned at the medical center, when David's number flashed on my screen. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice was strained, different. The warmth that usually filled our conversations was gone, replaced by something cold and distant that made my stomach drop. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? Can you come over? Tonight? Arya says she has something important to show us both." The way he said her name, like he was already taking her side, made my chest tighten. "David, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "Just come over, Mom. Please." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, my hands trembling. This was it. Whatever Arya had planned, whatever information she'd gathered, she was ready to deploy it. The drive to their house felt like driving to my own execution. Every familiar landmark, the old oak tree where David used to climb as a boy, the corner store where I'd bought him candy after doctor visits, seemed to mock me with memories of happier times. Their house was a modest 2-story colonial in a newer subdivision, the kind of place young families bought when they were just starting out. David's pickup truck sat in the driveway next to Arya's sedan, and every window in the house seemed to glow with warm yellow light. From the outside, it looked like the picture of domestic happiness. If only they knew what darkness was brewing inside. David answered the door before I could even knock. My son, now 35 years old, stood there looking like a stranger. His usually friendly face was pinched with confusion and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "Where's Christopher?" I asked, stepping into the foyer. "At my mom's for the night." Arya's voice came from the living room. She appeared in the doorway, and I could see she'd been preparing for this moment. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite it being a weeknight. She wore a cream-colored sweater that made her look young and innocent, a calculated choice, I was sure. We moved into the living room, where Arya had arranged a small presentation area. A laptop sat open on the coffee table, surrounded by manila folders and what looked like photocopied documents. The whole setup had an official legal feel to it that made my mouth go dry. "Mom?" David said, gesturing to the couch. "Why don't you sit down?" I remained standing, my purse clutched tightly against my chest. "David, before whatever this is begins, I need you to know that I love you. I have always loved you from the moment you came into my life." Arya's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but her eyes remained ice cold. "That's interesting phrasing, Janet. The moment he came into your life." David frowned, looking between us. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, Arya opened the laptop and turned it toward us. The screen showed what appeared to be a scanned document, official-looking, with state seals and legal terminology. My vision blurred for a moment as I recognized it, David's original birth certificate, the one from before the adoption was finalized. "David," Arya said softly, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, gentle, almost loving. "There's something your mother never told you. Something she's been hiding for your entire life." "Arya, please," I whispered, but she held up a hand to silence me. "Your name wasn't always David Mitchell," she continued, her eyes never leaving my son's face. "Your birth name was David James Morrison. Your birth mother was a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Morrison, and your birth father was listed as unknown." David's face went white. He sank onto the couch as if his legs had given out. "What are you talking about?" Arya clicked to the next document, the adoption decree, dated when David was 6 months old. "Janet isn't your biological mother, David. She adopted you when you were a baby." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to speak but couldn't find words. I watched my son's world crumble in real time, saw the moment when everything he'd believed about his identity, his family, his very existence, shattered like glass. "Mom?" He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with shock and growing hurt. "Is this true?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Arya wasn't finished. "There's more," she said, clicking to another document. "I found records showing that your birth mother tried to maintain contact over the years. There are notes in her file indicating she wrote letters that were never delivered, that she tried to visit but was turned away. This was a lie, and I knew it immediately. The adoption had been closed, final, with no contact between birth and adoptive families. But David didn't know that, and the way Arya presented the information, mixed with legitimate documents, made it sound credible. She kept track of you through public records, Arya continued, her voice taking on a sympathetic tone. Newspaper clippings from your high school graduation, your wedding announcement, even Christopher's birth announcement. She collected them all, hoping someday she'd be able to reconnect with her son. David's face was crumpling now, the weight of this fabricated narrative crushing him. My birth mother wanted to know me? According to these records, Arya said, gesturing to a folder I was certain contained more manufactured evidence. She tried for years to make contact, but Janet blocked every attempt. That's not true. I finally found my voice, stepping forward. David, honey, the adoption was completely legal and above board. Your birth mother made a brave, loving decision to give you up because she wanted you to have opportunities she couldn't provide. But why didn't you tell me? David's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why lie about it for 35 years? Arya leaned forward, her expression now radiating false compassion. And Janet, there's something else you need to explain. Something about the timing of Robert's death. My blood turned to ice water. What about Robert? She pulled out another document, Robert's death certificate. Robert died in March of 1988. But according to these adoption papers, the adoption wasn't finalized until May of that same year. You completed a single-parent adoption while grieving your husband's death. Why were you so desperate to keep David that you proceeded with the adoption even after becoming a widow? The implication hung in the air like poison gas. She was suggesting that I'd somehow manipulated the system, that my motives for keeping David weren't pure. The truth was that Robert's death had made the adoption process more complicated, but our social worker had been incredibly supportive, understanding that David was already bonded to us and that disrupting his placement would have been traumatic for everyone involved. But Arya's presentation made it sound sinister, calculated. I kept David because he was already my son, I said, my voice stronger now despite my racing heart, because he belonged with me, regardless of biology. Or, Arya said smoothly, because you couldn't have children of your own and you weren't willing to give up the baby you'd grown attached to, even if it meant depriving him of knowledge about his real family. David buried his face in his hands. I don't understand any of this. Why now? Why are you telling me this now? Arya moved to sit beside him on the couch, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Because Christopher asked me why he doesn't look like Grandma Janet. And when I started researching our family history, I found all of this. I thought you deserved to know the truth about where you came from. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab David by the shoulders and shake him, make him see through Arya's manipulation. But I could see in his eyes that the damage was already done. The seed of doubt had been planted and was already taking root. David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never told you because I wanted to protect you. You were my son from the moment I held you. Biology didn't matter to me. He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw my little boy, the child who used to run to me with scraped knees and bad dreams, but then his expression hardened. But it mattered to my birth mother, didn't it? And you took that choice away from both of us. Arya's smile was triumphant, though she tried to hide it. David, there's one more thing you need to see. She reached for the final folder, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was inside would be the killing blow. Arya opened the final folder with the deliberate care of someone savoring a moment of victory. Inside were photocopied pages that looked like they'd been torn from a journal, written in a young woman's handwriting. These are excerpts from Sarah Morrison's diary, Arya announced, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. I was able to obtain copies through a private investigator who specializes in adoption reunification cases. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. Sarah Morrison's personal journals? There was no way Arya could have legitimately obtained such intimate documents, which meant she was either fabricating evidence or had somehow violated this young woman's privacy in ways that bordered on criminal. Listen to this, Arya said, clearing her throat dramatically. March 15th, 1992. David would be 4 years old today. I drove by the house again, hoping to catch a glimpse of him playing in the yard. His adoptive mother saw me and came outside, telling me I had no right to be there. She said if I didn't stop coming around, she'd call the police. All I wanted was to see my little boy, to know he was happy and healthy. David's face went ashen. You knew she was watching the house and you threatened her? I felt the world tilting beneath my feet. David, that's not how it happened. I never. There's more, Arya interrupted, flipping to another page. June 8th, 1996. I wrote David a letter for his 8th birthday, explaining why I had to give him up and how much I've always loved him. I asked Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor, to give it to his mother. She promised she would, but I never heard back. I wonder if she even showed it to him. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who'd mentioned seeing someone watching our house years ago. Had Arya somehow tracked her down and convinced her to corroborate this story? Or was this another fabrication designed to sound plausible? I never received any letter, I said firmly. David, you have to believe me. But my son wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the journal pages with an expression of growing devastation. She tried to stay in touch. My birth mother tried to maintain a relationship and you blocked her. The adoption was closed, I said desperately. It was a legal, binding arrangement. There was no provision for ongoing contact between. Legal doesn't make it right, Arya said softly, her voice dripping with false sympathy. A mother's love doesn't end because she signs papers. She turned to another page. This one dated much more recently. January 3rd, 2023, and I saw David's wedding photo in the newspaper. He looked so much like his father, the same dark hair, the same smile. I hope his wife knows how lucky she is. I hope his children will know about me someday, will understand that giving him up was the hardest thing I ever did, but I did it because I loved him. The tears streaming down David's face broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. This was exactly what Arya had wanted. To paint me as the villain in a story where a loving birth mother had been cruelly separated from her child by a selfish adoptive mother who cared more about her own needs than anyone else's. Where is she now? David asked, his voice thick with emotion. Where is Sarah Morrison? Arya's expression flickered for just a moment, and I caught it. A split second of uncertainty, of someone who'd painted themselves into a corner. She died 2 years ago. Cancer, of course. How convenient that Sarah Morrison was no longer alive to contradict whatever story Arya had constructed. Dead people couldn't dispute false journal entries or clarify misrepresented events. But she left instructions, Arya continued quickly. A letter to be delivered to you after her death, along with all her collected memories and photos. The private investigator was able to track down the lawyer handling her estate. She pulled out one final document, what appeared to be a letter addressed to David in the same handwriting as the diary entries. My son reached for it with trembling hands, but I moved faster. Stop! My voice cut through the room like a blade. Just stop! Both David and Arya looked at me in surprise. I was done being defensive, done allowing this woman to orchestrate my family's destruction with her carefully crafted lies. Arya, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. How exactly did you come into contact with this private investigator? How did you even know to start looking for David's birth mother? She blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned. I told you. I was researching our family genealogy. No, I interrupted. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? This isn't about genealogy or helping David connect with his roots. This is about control. David frowned, looking between us. Mom, what are you talking about? I turned to face my son, knowing that what I was about to say might cost me everything, but also knowing that I couldn't let Arya's manipulation stand unchallenged. David, has Arya ever pressured you to change your will, to make sure Christopher's inheritance is protected from outside influences? His confusion deepened. What does that have to do with anything? Has she ever suggested that I might try to claim rights to your house, your savings, your assets as your adoptive parent? Has she ever planted seeds of doubt about my intentions regarding your family's financial future? The silence that followed was telling. I could see in David's face that I'd hit on something, that Arya had indeed been laying groundwork for this revelation for months. "That's ridiculous," Arya said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This has nothing to do with money or inheritance, doesn't it?" I pressed. "You've systematically isolated David from me over the past year. You've made it difficult for me to see Christopher, created conflict at every family gathering, and now you're using fabricated evidence to destroy my relationship with my son. What's your endgame here, Arya?" She stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "I'm protecting my family. You've had 35 years to control David's life, to make him dependent on you, to be the center of his world. But he has a wife and son now, and we don't need you hovering over us, manipulating us." The mask had finally slipped. This wasn't about David's right to know his birth family or any noble desire for truth. This was about Arya's need to be the only important woman in David's life. "You're lying about the journals," I said calmly. "Sarah Morrison may have existed, but these diary entries are fabricated. You created them to support a narrative that would turn David against me." "That's insane," Arya snapped. "Why would I make something like this up? Because you want me out of your lives completely. Because you can't stand that David loves me, that Christopher adores his grandmother, that I'm a permanent part of this family, whether you like it or not." David was staring at both of us now, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. "Stop it," he said quietly. "Both of you, just stop." But I couldn't stop. Not when I was this close to exposing the truth. "David, ask her to provide contact information for this private investigator. Ask her to show you the original documents, not photocopies. Ask her to explain how she gained access to sealed adoption records and private medical files." Arya's face had gone pale. "I don't have to prove anything to her." "No," I agreed. "But you should be willing to prove it to David. After all, if you're telling the truth, verification should be easy." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. David looked at his wife with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the calculating woman I'd always known her to be. "Arya," he said slowly, "where exactly did you get these documents?" And in that moment, I knew I had her. Arya's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I watched as different emotions flickered across her face: panic, anger, calculation, and finally, a desperate kind of defiance. "I got them from a legitimate source," she said finally, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "A private investigator who specializes in adoption cases." "What's his name?" David asked, his tone sharper now. "What agency does he work for?" Arya's eyes darted between us. I don't remember the exact name off the top of my head. I have his information at work." "At work?" I pressed. "The same work where you have access to medical records dating back to the 1980s. "Hurst?" The color drained from her face completely. David's expression shifted from confusion to something darker as he began to piece together what I was implying. "Arya," he said slowly, "did you use your position at the medical center to access private records?" "I didn't do anything illegal," she said quickly, but her defensive tone betrayed her. "Patient records are confidential, but adoption records are different." "No, they're not," I interrupted. "Sealed adoption records require court orders to access. You know that, which means either you broke the law to get this information or you fabricated it entirely." David stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. Arya, just tell me the truth. Where did you really get these documents?" Instead of answering, Arya did something that confirmed every suspicion I'd had about her character. She attacked. "Why are you taking her side?" she demanded, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "She lied to you for 35 years. She kept you from knowing your real mother, and now you're defending her?" "Because," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, "my mother has never lied to me about anything else in my entire life. But you've been acting strange for months, making weird comments about my family, trying to drive a wedge between me and Mom. And now you're presenting evidence that conveniently can't be verified because everyone involved is dead." I felt a surge of pride in my son. Despite the shock of learning about his adoption, despite the emotional manipulation Arya had subjected him to. His fundamental sense of logic was asserting itself. "David, I need you to know something," I said, moving closer to him. "Yes, you were adopted. That part is true. But everything else Arya has told you tonight is either fabricated or twisted beyond recognition." I took a deep breath, knowing that complete honesty was the only way forward. "Your birth mother, Sarah Morrison, was indeed 16 when she gave birth to you. She was brave and selfless, and she made an incredibly difficult decision because she wanted what was best for you. The adoption was completely closed, no ongoing contact, no letters, no attempts at reunification. That was the arrangement she specifically requested because she felt it would be easier for everyone involved." Arya started to protest, but David held up a hand to silence her. "Your father Robert and I were chosen to be your parents after extensive screening and interviews," I continued. "When Robert died 2 months before the adoption was finalized, I could have backed out. The agency gave me that option, but by then, you'd been with us for 4 months. You were already my son in every way that mattered." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I pushed on. "I never told you about the adoption because I wanted you to grow up feeling completely secure in your identity, never questioning whether you truly belonged with me. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I should have told you when you were older, but I made that decision out of love, not manipulation." David sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. "Why now, though? Why is this coming out now?" I looked directly at Arya, who was standing rigidly by the window, her arms crossed defensively. "Because your wife has been systematically trying to remove me from your lives. She's been poisoning Christopher against me, creating conflict at every family gathering, and now she's fabricated this elaborate story to finally drive the wedge between us that she's been working toward for years." "That's not true," Arya said, but her voice was weak. "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Tell David about the conversation you had with Mrs. Peterson 3 weeks ago. Tell him about how you convinced an 83-year-old woman to remember things that never happened." Arya's face went white. "How did you—" "Because I called her after I spoke with you today," I said. "And she felt terrible about lying for you. She said you told her you were trying to help David connect with his birth family, that it was a surprise for his birthday. She's been worried sick that she did something wrong." David's head snapped up. "You involved Mrs. Peterson in this?" The pieces were falling into place now, and I could see in David's expression that he was beginning to understand the scope of Arya's deception. "The journal entries," I continued, "were created on your laptop, Arya. The handwriting analysis would prove they're all written by the same person in the same time period, not spread out over decades like you claimed." "You can't prove that," she said desperately. "Actually, I can." I pulled out my phone and showed David a photograph I'd taken earlier that day. "This is Sarah Morrison's actual signature from the adoption paperwork. Notice how different the handwriting is from those journal entries?" David examined the photo, then looked at the papers Arya had presented. Even to an untrained eye, the differences were obvious. "And the private investigator?" he asked. "Doesn't exist," I said simply. "At least not in the context Arya described. I spent the afternoon calling every licensed private investigator in the state who handles adoption cases. None of them have worked on anything involving a Sarah Morrison or a David Morrison." The silence that followed was deafening. Arya stood frozen by the window, trapped in a web of lies that was finally unraveling. David stared at the fabricated documents spread across his coffee table, seeing them now for what they really were. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arya, why would you do this?" She turned from the window, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She looked young and frightened, like the child she still was in many ways. "Because she's always there," Arya said, tears streaming down her face. "Every holiday, every milestone, every decision we make, it's always about what Janet thinks, what Janet wants, what Janet would do. I married you, David, but I never felt like I had all of you. Part of you always belonged to her." David's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "That's what family is, Arya. We don't stop loving our parents when we get married. We expand our capacity for love." "But it's not fair," she said, her voice taking on a childish quality that made me understand, finally, what this was really about. Arya wasn't evil. She was immature and insecure, desperate for the kind of unconditional love that David and I shared. "You're right," I said, surprising both of them. "It's not fair." They both looked at me in confusion. It's not fair that David had the security of growing up with parents who adored him while his birth mother struggled with the grief of her decision. It's not fair that I got to experience all of David's childhood milestones while she missed everything. And it's not fair that you felt like an outsider in your own marriage. I took a step toward Arya, speaking directly to her. "But life isn't fair, sweetheart. And the answer isn't to tear down the love that already exists. It's to find ways to build more love, more security, more connection." David stood up and moved to his wife, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Arya, if you felt left out, why didn't you just talk to me? We could have worked on it together." She looked up at him with eyes full of tears and something that might have been hope. "I was afraid you'd choose her over me." "I would never make you choose between me and your mother," David said firmly. "Just like I would never choose between you and her. You're both essential parts of my life." I watched as my son, my adopted son who was every bit as much mine as if I'd given birth to him, wrapped his arms around his confused, frightened wife. And in that moment, I saw a possibility I hadn't considered before. Maybe this crisis, as painful as it had been, could actually bring us all closer together. Maybe Arya's desperate need for belonging could be met not by pushing me out, but by bringing her in. But first, we had to address what she'd put Christopher through, and figure out how to undo the damage she'd done to a 7-year-old boy's understanding of family and love. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen with Christopher perched on a step stool beside me, his small hands carefully measuring flour into our mixing bowl. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns across the counter, where we'd spread out all the ingredients for his favorite chocolate chip cookies. "Grandma Janet," he said, concentrating hard on not spilling the flour. "Mommy said she's sorry for making me say those mean things to you." My heart squeezed tight, the way it always did when he brought up that terrible day in the grocery store. "I know she is, sweetheart, and I've forgiven her. But why did she tell me you weren't my real grandma?" He looked up at me with those serious blue eyes that reminded me so much of David at that age. That was a lie, wasn't it? I set down my measuring cup and gave him my full attention. Over the past few months, David, Arya, and I had worked together to undo the damage that had been done. But it was an ongoing process. Children's understanding of family relationships is both simpler and more complex than adults often realize. "Your mommy was feeling scared and sad," I explained, using the language we'd all agreed upon. "Sometimes when grown-ups feel that way, they make mistakes. She thought if you loved me less, you might love her more. But that's not how love works." Christopher nodded seriously. "Daddy explained it to me. He said love isn't like pie." I smiled, remembering David's analogy. "That's right. If love was like pie, then giving some to one person would mean less for everyone else. But love is more like sunlight. The more you share it, the brighter everything becomes. And you're still my real grandma even though you didn't grow me in your tummy like Mommy grew me in hers." "I am absolutely your real grandma," I said firmly, pulling him into a hug that smelled like flower and childhood and infinite possibility. "Family isn't just about who shares your DNA, Christopher. It's about who loves you, who takes care of you, who shows up for you every single day." The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted our baking session. Christopher scrambled down from his step stool and ran to the window. "It's Mommy and Daddy," he announced, his face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy that comes so naturally to children. I felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that still accompanied Arya's visits. Things were better between us, dramatically better, but there were still moments of awkwardness, still conversations that required careful navigation. David came through the back door first, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and wearing the kind of smile that told me today was going to be a good day. Arya followed more hesitantly, but she was smiling too, and when she hugged Christopher, I saw nothing but genuine maternal love in her expression. "How are my favorite bakers doing?" David asked, surveying our flour-dusted kitchen with amusement. "We're making the cookies with the chips that look like teardrops," Christopher announced importantly. "Chocolate chips," I translated laughing. "And we saved some dough for you to roll into balls." As we worked together, 4 generations in my small kitchen. I marveled at how much had changed since that awful night 3 months ago. The process hadn't been easy. There had been tears, difficult conversations, and moments when I wasn't sure we'd be able to rebuild what had been broken. The turning point had come when David sat Arya down and explained, with remarkable patience, that her insecurity about my place in his life was actually damaging the very relationships she was trying to protect. He'd made it clear that any future manipulation involving Christopher would result in serious consequences, but he'd also acknowledged that he could do a better job of making her feel prioritized and valued. For my part, I'd had to examine my own behavior honestly. Had I sometimes overstepped boundaries? Had I been so focused on maintaining my close relationship with David that I'd inadvertently made Arya feel like an outsider? The answer, uncomfortably, was probably yes. "Janet," Arya said now, interrupting my thoughts, "I brought something for you." She pulled a small wrapped package from her purse, her cheeks slightly pink with embarrassment. "It's not much," but I thought, well, I wanted to do something. I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small silver picture frame containing a photo I'd never seen before. It showed Christopher and me from the previous month, both of us laughing as we tried to untangle Christmas lights in preparation for the holidays. Our faces were genuine and relaxed, captured in a moment of pure joy. "I took it while you two were decorating," Arya explained. "I realized I'd never really seen you together before. I mean, really seen you. I was always so focused on what I thought you were taking away from me that I never noticed what you were giving to him." The photo showed what Arya had finally learned to see, that my love for Christopher didn't diminish her importance in his life. If anything, it enriched it. A child surrounded by adults who love him unconditionally is a child who learns to love unconditionally in return. "This is beautiful," I said, and I meant it. "Thank you." "There's something else," she said, looking nervously at David, who nodded encouragingly. "I want to tell you about Sarah Morrison." My breath caught. We'd agreed months ago that the fabricated story about David's birth mother would never be mentioned again, but I could see that Arya had something important to say. "I did find some real information about her," she continued, "not through any private investigator or anything dramatic like that. Just through legitimate genealogy websites that David had already given me permission to use." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph, a high school yearbook picture of a young woman with David's dark hair and serious eyes. She did exist, and she did give birth to David, but everything else I made up. Arya's voice was steady now, no longer the desperate, manipulative tone of 3 months ago. "The truth is much simpler. She was 16. From a family that couldn't support another child. She chose adoption because she wanted David to have opportunities she couldn't provide, and according to the records I could find, she went on to finish high school, became a nurse, got married, and had 2 more children." David studied the photo intently. "Is she still alive?" "As far as I can tell, yes. She lives about 200 miles north of here with her husband. Her name now is Sarah Chen." The kitchen fell silent, except for the timer ticking down on our cookies. I watched David process this information, saw him weighing his options. "Do you want to try to contact her?" I asked gently. He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "Maybe someday, but not now. Right now, I'm focusing on the family I have." He looked around the kitchen at all of us, his wife, his son, his mother who'd raised him with all the love in the world despite not sharing his DNA. "Besides," he added with a smile, "I learned something important over the past few months. Biology might determine where you come from, but love determines where you belong." Christopher, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the solemn attention children bring to serious moments, suddenly piped up, "The cookies are ready," and just like that, the heavy moment dissolved into laughter, and the controlled chaos of removing hot cookies from the oven and trying to wait long enough for them to cool before eating them. Later, as David and his family prepared to leave, Arya lingered behind while David loaded Christopher into the car. "Janet," she said quietly, "I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for the lies about the adoption, but for all of it. For the way I treated you, for the things I put Christopher through, for trying to come between you and David." I studied her face, seeing something there I'd never seen before, genuine remorse, but also a kind of peace. What changed? I asked. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, it reached her eyes. I realized that you weren't my competition. You were my example. What do you mean? Watching you with Christopher, seeing how you loved David even when he disappointed you, even when I was actively trying to turn him against you. She paused, choosing her words carefully. That's the kind of mother I want to be. The kind who loves without conditions, who puts her child's well-being above her own insecurities. Before I could respond, she continued. And I realized something else. Christopher is incredibly lucky to have a grandmother who loves him the way you do. I don't want to take that away from him. I want to learn from it. As I watched their car pull away, Christopher's small hand waving frantically from the back window, I felt a sense of completeness I hadn't experienced in years. My family was intact, stronger even than it had been before the crisis that had threatened to tear us apart. The truth about David's adoption was no longer a secret hanging over our heads. Arya's insecurities had been acknowledged and addressed. Christopher understood that family is defined by love, not biology. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't stepping aside. It's making room for them to step forward. That evening, I placed Arya's photo on my mantelpiece next to all the other family pictures that chronicled our lives together. In the image, Christopher and I are caught in a moment of pure happiness. Two people connected not by blood, but by something even stronger, the choice to love each other unconditionally. Looking at it now, I could see what Arya had finally learned to see, that love multiplies when shared, that security comes from inclusion rather than exclusion, and that the bonds that matter most are the ones we choose to nurture every single day. Family, I realized, isn't about who gave you life. It's about who makes your life worth living. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.